Hello class, and welcome back to our discussion of American history. This section will cover the early republic and the antebellum period. Basically what we're looking at here in this section is the 60-year period from basically the time Jefferson takes office till the split between the North and the South, which will eventually lead to the Civil War. The Civil War and Reconstruction will be our last section. But one thing that I want you to look at, okay, as we move through section 3, 1800, we had this election that's sometimes called the Revolution of 1800. The country seems to be strong. The Constitution seems to be working. You know, everything seems to be going well. And 60 years later, the country will tear itself in half. And so as we move through this section, we cover this 60-year period. I want you to pay attention to the factors that lead to the country tearing in half. It will not be a thing that we discuss at once. Okay, this will be something that keeps coming back over and over and over again as we go through this section. Now, our first two videos from this section are going to focus on the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. Remember, Thomas Jefferson was elected in 1800. He will be a two-term president, so he'll be re-elected in 1804. He is a Democratic Republican. He's our first Democratic Republican president, and he will emphasize equality, justice, and freedom of speech, religion, and the press. All right, so we will be, those are important things that he stressed during his administration. We associate Jefferson's presidency with an idea we call Jeffersonian democracy. Basically, Jefferson believed that the federal government should stay small. Remember, he was opposed to the Federalist Party, which believed in bigger government. He believed in smaller government, so he thought that the federal government should stay small. Jefferson also believed that the executive branch, which would be himself, he is the executive branch, he's the president, but he believes that the executive branch should defer to Congress. Congress should be the ones really making the decisions for the country, and the president's job is simply to execute those decisions. Jefferson believed this because he believed that Congress is really what represents the people. That's where the will of the people is most present, is in Congress. And so that's why he believed the executive should defer to Congress. Congress has the power because the people have the power. The president's job is just to carry out those duties and enforce those laws. Another thing that is associated with Jeffersonian democracy is the idea of a natural aristocracy. And this idea can be a little confusing today. It can be a little controversial today. But again, you have to remember we're talking about a different people in a different time. People who grew up in a world much different than ours. We grew up in the world that these men created, but they grew up in a world that other men created. And Jefferson believed in a natural aristocracy. You have to remember that Jefferson is he's pro-France. He is a Francophile. He is, as opposed to the Federalists who are pro-British. But during this time period, before Jefferson's presidency and after, France is going through a revolutionary period. And in the French Revolution is really where we get the ideas of what is called left wing and right wing. Those terms, left wing and right wing, can move depending on what the topic is. For example, in France, people who would have been right-wing would have supported the monarchy, whereas people who were left-wing would have supported a republic. But once the monarchy was abolished and they became a republic, you would still have a left wing and a right wing. They would just be focused on another issue. Okay, you know, should the republic resemble something like this, or should it resemble something like that? And so it's a sliding scale. Jefferson, in terms of what the world has been like, he's pretty liberal. He's what we would call, liberal, but he believes in a natural aristocracy, which is sort of a right-wing approach. So when we think of left and right, typically people would say the left emphasizes equality, the right emphasizes an aristocracy, which would be the case in France. But Jefferson looks at this a little bit differently. Jefferson believes in equality. Jefferson's the guy who wrote "All men are created equal" in the Declaration of Independence. But Jefferson also knows that if people have the freedom to pursue excellence, that some people will naturally set themselves apart. So Jefferson believes there are some people naturally suited to be leaders. And so there is a sort of a weird contradiction here where Jefferson is emphasizing equality. But we have to remember that in the American sense of the word, it means equal before the law. People are equal before the law, but yet there are some who are still better fit to lead than others. Okay, so he believed that government should be filled by this natural aristocracy. And he believed that people should be well educated, that you should not have a role in government if you are not well educated. And of course, Jefferson was very well educated. But Jefferson did support public education. So you have to be aware that here's Jefferson saying, people are equal, but I think the only people that should be in charge are this natural aristocracy that are made of well-educated people. Yet at the same time, he is emphasizing public education. Another thing that's associated with Jefferson is this idea of Republican virtue. Republican virtue is sometimes called civic virtue, but it is the desire to act for the public good rather than personal gain. In other words, people should do what's best for the nation, all right, rather than what's best for themselves. Now, this idea is not anything new. This goes back to, Rome, to the Roman Republic. But it's important to understand here that the problem is in America, we have created a republic. Okay, we are not a monarchy anymore. So who rules in a republic? Well, the people do. The people rule themselves. And so that's kind of dangerous. If you're going to give people the power to rule themselves, you need to make sure that those people do what's best for the nation and not what's best for themselves. So this idea of Republican virtue was emphasized heavily because if you're going to let people vote, they need to vote for what's good, not necessarily what's best for them, not what benefits them. All right. So that was very important in our founding. A lot of people would argue that we've lost sight of this, that people today vote for what's best for themselves, not necessarily what's best for the nation. And that's why this idea of Republican virtue was such an important part of American identity in the early republic. Going along with this idea of education, obviously our identity is going to be shaped by education. We just said that Jefferson believes strongly in education. We're going to see public universities. These, there were universities already in America, Yale, Harvard, things like that. But these were private universities. But now the idea of public institutions of higher learning are being created. There's two, and actually three universities who sort of claim to be the first public university. The University of Georgia in Athens was the first state chartered public university. So on paper, the University of Georgia is the oldest public university in the United States. However, it only existed on paper when the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill first started admitting students. So On paper, the University of Georgia existed first, but UNC was the first to actually have students attending classes. And then it's not listed here, but the third college that claims to be the oldest public university in America is the College of William and Mary. The College of William and Mary was actually where Thomas Jefferson went to college. That was his alma mater. However, that college is older than University of Georgia or the University of North Carolina, but it was a private college for most of its history. So it was not a public university until much later. Another guy who's associated with American education and American identity is Noah Webster. Noah Webster has been called the father of American scholarship and education. You are probably most familiar with Noah Webster because of the American Dictionary of the English Language. This is the guy who wrote and sort of standardized American English. Obviously, we speak the same language as England. England speaks English, but we wanted to separate ourselves and sort of establish an American identity. So we created an American version of the language, and this is attributed to Webster. This is why we have words that are spelled differently than British English. Another guy associated with American identity and is writers, right? Writers who were writing about America. American writers writing about America help establish our American identity. So we have Washington Irving. Washington Irving wrote some pretty famous short stories, fiction stories like Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He was also a biographer, so he wrote biographies of some pretty famous Americans like George Washington. James Fenimore Cooper. James Fenimore Cooper was an American novelist. He's famous for the Leatherstocking Tales. Probably the most famous of those Leatherstocking Tales is his book, The Last of the Mohicans. And then Mercy Otis Warren. She was a nonfiction writer. She wrote History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. So she wrote a history of the American Revolution. Art, okay, paintings. This is definitely part of establishing American identity. Charles Willson Peale, probably the most famous painter from the time period. He was in the Revolutionary War and he made paintings of the Revolutionary War. So paintings of famous events that occurred during the war, also famous paintings of people like George Washington. Another guy here, and this one's in bold, so you won't remember this one, but Samuel Jennings painted this painting, which is called Liberty Displaying the Arts and Sciences. This painting is significant because it approaches the issue of race. And so when we're talking about American identity in the early republic, it's important to remember that these people who are sort of framing what the idea it means to be an American are really only talking about the white population. There's two other significant demographics in America that aren't white, right? So the black population and the American Indian population. And so we'll talk about how those fit into this American identity. But Jennings recognizes this, and he puts it in this painting to call attention to the fact that, hey, there are other people here. And he's almost saying, hey, how does slavery coexist with this identity that we're claiming is centered around liberty? Another writer, William Bartram. He wrote Bartram's Travels. He was a naturalist. So a naturalist is sort of a like a 19th, 18th, 19th century biologist. He studies plants and animals and writes about them. And then Benjamin Franklin founded what was called the American Philosophical Society. So he wanted to promote American scholarship in the humanities and the natural sciences. And so his American Philosophical Society was the foundation for that. All right, so back to the idea of how do these other demographics fit into American identity. So the first one we'll look at is Indians. And by the time of the early republic, so let's just say the early 1800s, there is sort of a contradiction about how American Indians fit into American identity. And it really depends a lot to do with location. So people on the frontier, all right, if you lived in Kentucky or, uh, Tennessee or Ohio, there is a very good chance that you have either in the very recent past been at war with Indians or could be at war with Indians in the very near future. And so there existed a stereotype on the frontier that Indians were, for the most part, bloodthirsty savages, um, not to be trusted. They needed to be killed. They needed to be removed. Sort of this idea, okay? Meanwhile, if you go to the East Coast, by the time we get to the 1800s, there is starting to be an embracement of Native imagery. The people on the East Coast begins to identify with the Indians because, again, we're creating an American identity. Well, what makes white English-speaking people different than white English-speaking people? It's hard to say, but Britain doesn't have a lot of Indians running around in it, and America does. So there's an embracement of the Indian from another stereotypical point of view, which we call the noble savage, right? So in the East, they embrace this idea of the noble savage. In the West, they embrace this idea of the bloodthirsty savage. And the truth is, both of those are inconvenient stereotypes. Both of them are inaccurate. Indians are individuals, and they are part of societies with their own complex histories and politics and religions, and there's lots of things going on. And neither one of these stereotypes would have been correct, but the location of the people who are, attributing these traits to the Indians, it matters. So obviously, if you went back in Boston to 1675, back during King Philip's War, those people in Boston in 1675 likely did not have a favorable view of Indians. But when we fast forward 100 years, people in Boston haven't really had too many issues with Indians. Indians have not been a threat to Boston in a few generations. So they're more likely to embrace that character that they've created. Meanwhile, people on the frontier who are still actively dealing with the Indian threat, like the people of Massachusetts would have dealt with 100 years earlier, they have a very different view. Both views are problematic, okay? But let's look at Jefferson's policy. What does Jefferson believe should happen to the Indians? And Jefferson believed in a policy of assimilation. He basically believes that the Indians should become white Americans, okay? From Jefferson's point of view, and not just him, but the prevailing view of the time, was that there was no room for Indians in America. So obviously they're there, so they need to change. They need to become like white Americans. So they need to change their language. They need to stop speaking whatever Iroquoian, Algonquin, Siouan, whatever language it is they speak, and start speaking English. They need to change religion and become Christians, preferably, Protestant Christianity. And they should change their livelihood rather than being hunter and gatherer type people who semi-nomadic and do a little bit of farming, that they should become full-time agrarian peoples who are settled. And so this would be a dramatic change. This would be a shift in gender roles, because in Indian culture, women farmed and men hunted. Obviously, in European culture and now white American culture, men farm. And so if these Indians are going to assimilate, these Indians basically have to give up hunting, which is masculine, and become farmers, which is feminine, from their point of view. And so you can see how this would be problematic. The other demographic in America that doesn't fit into the white American identity would be the black population. When you're dealing with the black population, you essentially have two sub-demographics. You have the free black population and the enslaved black population. Obviously, the enslaved population is not going to have, much conversation about how they think they should fit into American society, because they're just going to basically be seen as a labor force. But the issue of slavery is, of course, going to be heavily debated, and we're going to be talking about this a lot over the next, several videos. But the free population, how does the free population fit into this American identity? Are they going to be just like white Americans? What do we do with those? That's sort of the question that people have. So there's a question surrounding, should slavery be allowed to continue? But there's another question of, what do we do with the black people who aren't slaves? All right, and one of the solutions, all right, was something called the American Colonization Society. Now, this is founded in 1816, so this is going to be after Jefferson. We're just sort of establishing identity right now. But this was founded, basically the ideology here is that black people, all right, they don't belong in American society. And so they are native to Africa, and therefore the United States should create a colony in Africa, and these black people, these former slaves, should be returned to Africa. Now, obviously, that's a very problematic thing to say, especially, today. Hearing this without any sort of context, obviously, would be problematic. But what needs to be understood is that there are some people back in this time period who thought this was the right thing, the moral thing. Okay, so like, for example, today, if some guy was out in front of a store or in front of the courthouse yelling about sending people back to Africa, obviously that guy he doesn't have good intentions on his mind. He's probably a racist, crazy person. But what the American Colonization Society is trying to argue is that these people were taken from there against their will, and they should be returned. And so the U.S. creates this colony, which is eventually a country called Liberia, for that purpose. Obviously, the name Liberia is associated with liberty. And so Liberia is created by the United States. And in fact, Liberia's first president is a former slave from Virginia. And so this does happen. However, there's a lot of opposition to this plan from two sources, okay? For one, abolitionists. So the people who are dead set against slavery, the abolitionist movement, which let me say this early, okay? We're going to talk about abolition a lot over the next several videos, but the abolitionist movement is not very big in the early 1800s. The abolition movement will grow from 1800 to 1860. But the abolitionists do not agree, for the most part, with this American Colonization Society idea, because they believe that black people are equal and should fit into our society. That would be their argument. And then the other opposition comes from a lot of the free black persons themselves, because their opinion is, hey, we've been here the whole time. We are not African, because these people, they weren't born in Africa. They are descendants of Africans, but they themselves are American born. And so their argument would be we don't know any more about Africa than a white person, and we would not fit in to Africa any better than a white person. You have to keep in mind that these people have lost their religion, right? They are probably now Protestant Christians. They have lost their language. They are now English-speaking people. And they do not, they probably don't know what part of Africa they came from. Because even though we know, when we go back and we look at the transatlantic slave trade, we know what African nations were trading with Europeans. You have to remember those Africans took those slaves in war. So there's layers to this, right? The slaves were purchased in America by slavers who who purchased slaves in Africa from Africans who took these slaves from other African nations in war. Okay, so they would have no idea where to go, what country they're from. They don't identify with that country anymore. They don't speak the language. They're not part of that religion, most likely. And so they don't want to go for the most part. I mean, obviously, a lot of them do because the country of Liberia is founded. But a lot of free blacks choose to stay in America. And so that's going to continue to be between the free black population and the enslaved black population. We have this split demographic, at least until the end of slavery, which we will see later. All right, last thing we'll talk about in this video is Washington, D.C. We will continue in the next video talking about Jefferson. In fact, we haven't really, other than Jeffersonian democracy, haven't really talked much about Jefferson specifically. But we will, okay? But Washington, D.C. So the Residence Act of 1790. Now, 1790 was before Jefferson. In fact, it was before Adams. This was when George Washington was president. But the Residence Act of 1790 basically created a permanent seat of government and a national capital. So the Residence Act of 1790 was the law passed by Congress that said we would have a national capital that would serve, it would be a federal district. It would not be part of a state. So the capital of the United States does not belong to any state. It belongs to the nation as a whole, but not a state. So it's part of the federal government only, all right? Now, the land itself was built between Virginia and Maryland. This was something, George Washington really wanted it. He wanted it to be in the South. And remember, today we're kind of wishy-washy on whether or not Maryland is the South today, but Maryland was definitely the South back then. So they choose the land between, on the Potomac River between Virginia and Maryland. So both states actually lose a little land here to create this federal district. It is obviously named Washington after the first president, George Washington, the father of our country. So think of Washington being, Washington City. The city is called Washington. Just like Savannah, Georgia, the city is called Savannah. Washington, D.C., the city is Washington. Now, Savannah, Georgia is Savannah, GA, Savannah, Georgia. Washington, D.C. is Washington, the District of Columbia. All right, so what in the world is that District of Columbia thing? Well, remember, Washington City is not part of a state. So it can't be Washington, Maryland, can't be Washington, Virginia. It is Washington, the District of Columbia. All right, now what is Columbia? Well, Columbia was the feminine form of Columbus, which is basically the way they're describing America. We don't hear that much anymore, but once upon a time, Columbia was a word used to describe America. America and Columbia were interchangeable. You could just as easily refer to where we lived as Columbia as America. And so if you've ever watched old movies or anything like that and you see Columbia pictures and there's a lady standing there and she looks like the Statue of Liberty, that is actually not the Statue of Liberty, that is Columbia, which is a feminine representation of America. So back in the old days, when you wanted to draw something that you couldn't really draw, like how do you draw a picture of America? You would do it as a woman. And so Columbia was the woman. Kind of like liberty is a woman or justice is a woman when we personify it as an image. So just think of it as Washington, which is part of America. That's what it is. Now, the engineer who sort of designed the city, his name was Lafont. And then the guys who laid out the city, who actually surveyed the roads and things like that, was primarily these guys called the Ellicott brothers. Andrew Ellicott, he was the chief surveyor, and he had two brothers working with him, Joseph and Benjamin. But there was another guy that was helping them and helping lay out the city, and his name was Benjamin Banneker. And it's not necessarily that he's more important than Andrew or Joseph or Benjamin Ellicott, but he is interesting to point out in the bigger picture of American history because he is a black man. So Benjamin Banneker was a black man who was one of the surveyors. He was an outstanding astronomer. He had an exceptionally good knowledge of reading the stars and the moon and things like that. And so he would publish almanacs that would, help predict the weather and things like that. And he was very intelligent. He wrote a lot of correspondence with Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson and Benjamin Banneker actually wrote each other back and forth, mostly discussing the issue of slavery. And Banneker was an early, so I mentioned earlier that the abolition movement was very small in the 1800s, the early 1800s. Abolitionists, just so we're clear, are people who believe slavery is wrong and they want to get rid of it. Okay, as we go through this course, we're gonna make some. We're going to point out the fact that there are people who could be anti-slavery and not necessarily an abolitionist. There might be people who are against the spread of slavery, but they don't necessarily want slavery gone from places like South Carolina. We'll deal with all that later. But for the most part, an abolitionist is against slavery based on moral reasons. They think it's wrong. And so abolitionists would use the example of Benjamin Banneker to prove the narrative of the time. The narrative of the time was that black people were really only good for labor. They weren't, couldn't be educated to be, leaders or part of this natural aristocracy. And the abolitionists would use this example, the example of Banneker, to sort of try to prove that narrative wrong. They're saying, hey, look at this guy. He's smart. He's laying out this city. He's doing surveying. He's publishing almanacs. And he's writing correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, who's not only the president of the United States, but arguably the smartest man in America. And so he's pretty important. Now we're going to end there, all right, for this video. The next video, we will focus a little more on the sort of the politics of things that are happening under Jefferson, and discuss some pretty significant events that happened during the Jefferson administration. And so stay tuned for that. We will discuss those things in the next video. Thank you very much.